Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in, thanks for watching. Today we are going to cover the reduce function in JavaScript. We're going to look at how to use that, how it can be useful, some of the different ways we can actually use it. I know I kind of wanted to dive into this because I've seen it kind of trip some people up. I know looking at it from afar without using it, it can seem like kind of a scary a function. It looks kind of strange at first glance, but it can be really useful. And I want to show some actual examples of maybe like real world scenarios where you might use something like this. So yeah, I think the basic way to think about it is when you have, and this is something that we call on arrays in JavaScript. So I think at first glance, think about it in terms of having an array of multiple values and then reducing that down into a single value and getting a single value back. I know a lot of times people use it to get like a sum of all values. So you'd see like an array of maybe numbers, and we'll take a look at that in a second, where you basically add up all the numbers and return the sum. And I remember when I first was learning reduce, that concept was a little weird because I mostly saw it in that context when you're adding stuff up and then thinking about reduce as like something getting smaller. But then I was seeing, I don't know, things being like added up and sums being returned. So I think it helps thinking about it in terms of taking a set of something and condensing it down into a single value that we then give back. Yeah, so that's sort of like a high level. Let's actually get into the code and look at some examples of how we can actually write this ourselves. So yeah, looking at this code editor here, I just have nothing written, obviously, and just this console here that's running so we can be able to log values and see things as we write some code. So let's look at just a basic example first. If we have an array here, and let's say we have a bunch of values in here, it doesn't matter what they are. So first we have this array, and let's say now we want to take that array, and as I said just a little bit earlier, a lot of examples of this you'll see when you take values in an array and then return the sum of those things, where you add all of those up. So let's just stick with that example here, where we can declare a new variable, say reduced array, where we say array.reduce. And let me type this out and then I'll explain what this is, what's going on here. So there's a couple things that reduce is going to need. There's a couple parameters here. We see this ACC and this val. And you'll see these two things named like this pretty commonly. And the first one stands for accumulator. And that just means, we can rename it here in this instance, the total, basically the running value that's being kept track of throughout as it's looping through this array and going through each index. It's sort of that one value is remaining through all of that. So this next one, this value, you might see it referred to as current val. It's just the actual, each index as it's looping through, it's just going to represent the current value for that. So as we can see here, we're just setting the total, which is basically the variable that's holding value, plus the current value. So the total plus each item as it goes through. So let's actually console log here, reduced array, and then we should see that number, and we do. Let's make this a little bit clearer here. Oops, that's not right. I meant to do that inside here. Reduced array. So we can see here that it's just going through each one and adding it up, and then giving you back the total, basically. Which is what this value is here that we can see, the sum of all these things. So let's take this one step further and say maybe we have an example where we have another array, and this one's filled with more arbitrary values. So say someone comes to us and says, hey, this first reduced array looks great, but now we need to take that second array and get the sum of that, but we also don't want to lose that first array. So obviously you might think what we could do is just declare a totally different variable, reduced array 2 or something like that. But in this case, just to be a little bit more efficient, we could say, we could just mutate the original reduced array. So let's say we turn it to let, this way we can mutate it. We'll say reduced array equals array2.reduce. And I'm just going to basically do the same logic that we saw here, where we return total plus current val, and we can see that's basically accomplishing the same thing here. The only difference here, there's one important distinction, is that reduce lets us pass in an initial value, basically something to set total to as it's going through. So we could say something like reduced array here. So this way it knows to start with this value first instead of starting, because normally it would start with the first index, but now it knows that, okay, I'm going to start with this reduced array, which in this case, passing it in here is going to equal this variable. So we can see here that this number got a little bit higher, and just so we can see the difference there is that when we don't pass in anything, it's just giving us the sum of this array, but when we do pass something, it's giving us the sum of both of those arrays. And that's just sort of a different way to do something like that. So if you have a case where you need to set an initial value, you can just pass it in. You can just pass it in like this as a second parameter to this reduce. So when would you see something like this being used in an actual project? And that's a good question. So let's think about, you probably have seen something like this, similar logic. If we think about maybe I don't know, you probably have seen a website where a site lets you basically keep track of your expenses throughout the week. So maybe you can go in and enter your expenses that you have for each week, and then it gives you back a monthly expense, which is the total of all your expenses. So that's sort of a pretty common thing. So if we think about it in those terms, we can say maybe we have a week 1 expense and maybe we have a week 2 expense, where we say something like this. And then maybe someone can go in and enter in a value for each day that they were spending money. And then instead of reduced array, maybe we have something like monthly expenses, to where, make this a little bit bigger. And maybe we have a monthly expense here that we can basically reduce each week. And I think in an actual world, we wouldn't manually write these things out. We might have a loop that will go through each week. But just for this example, we'll kind of do things out a little bit longer and manually so we can see what's going on here. But we can see we take each week, we reduce it down to a single value, and then we give back a monthly expense, and that's just the sum of everything. And you can think about, maybe that seems pretty common. I think that's there's tons of sites that do this exact thing, maybe in that they're not using this similar reduce architecture, but you can easily do something like this. So let's take things let's make things a little bit more complicated, because right now we're just summing up numbers, but we don't just have to stick to an array of numbers here. Let's say we had a people array, and in our people array we had name, Ryan, and then salary. Let's just stick to something very even. And then we had maybe 4 people, Z, and then Danielle. Maybe this person was making something like that. Maybe Lindsay's making 150, and maybe Danielle is doing really well at 200. So let's say we have an array of people with different salaries, and say the purpose of this was maybe we wanted a website where you could see the average salary that people are making in a specific area. You might see something like this on websites like Glassdoor and things like that, where you can see what you can expect the average person to be making. And So the idea is people could go in, maybe say what they make or something like that, and then we could give an average in the area. So we could very much use reduce for something like this. So we might see something like const reduced, or maybe we say total salary people dot reduce, and then we have our accumulator and our value, and I'll name this current val again just for clarity's sake. Okay, so let me do something that isn't going to work, just so we can see what's going on. So, oops. And let's console log our total salary here. So I'm writing the same logic purposefully so we can see we're basically doing the same thing where we take accumulator plus current value, but we can see here in this console we're getting this really weird a bunch of objects coming back instead of what we would expect is our salary. And that is, as we can see here, you might have already picked this up, but we are getting objects back for each item in the array. Remember, this is just a normal array, and this is just looping through it, so it's going through each item in that array. So the first thing we get on the first pass is this entire object. So what we would need to do is just dot notation into that to get salary. And we can see that we sort of get a number back, but we still get this weird object and this long string of numbers, and that's not at all what we're expecting to get. It's just concatenating on each salary here. So take a minute and see if you can think about why this is happening. It is something that we've seen before as a hint. So if you want to take a minute and pause the video and just kind of think about what's going on and why this is coming back like this, I think that would help. So if you figured it out, great. If you haven't figured it out, that's totally okay. But we can see here that we changed current value to dot salary, which is what we do want. But remember, this first pass, if we don't give an initial value, it's just going to try and use this first item in the array. And this is getting back an object here, which we can see is printing out to the console. Not what we want. We don't want it to use an object. So we can set an initial value here, and let's just set it to 0. That seems pretty logical because we want to start with nothing. So yeah, so this is a case where be very careful about what data structure and what your structures are when you're using reduce, because be mindful that if you don't supply an initial value, it's going to try and use the first thing in the array, and that's not what we want. So instead, we want to overwrite that with 0 instead. Let's get rid of these monthly expenses so we can see things just a little bit better. And then the final step here, if we want to do an average salary equals total salary divided by people.length. Whoops, that's not what I want. So we can do something, just a bit of math. Is that right? Total salary divided by the number that you're doing, which would be 4, yeah. So we can see we can do something like this, and then all of a sudden, let's just give back. Now we have our average salary by just doing a few lines of code here. So this is just a small example of times it would be useful to write reduce or use reduce. So it definitely depends on the context and what you're trying to use it for. But yeah, think about how this could be useful. These are just a couple of examples. But yeah, hopefully this makes sense. If you have any questions, you can definitely, I will do my best to answer any in the comments if you want to leave a comment, or follow me on Twitter, which I will put in the description. I'll also put a link to the Mozilla Developer Network. It's a really great site where you can see documentation and you can see examples of all of these types of things. You can see reduce along with all the other array methods that are available to us in JavaScript. So yeah, that is basically everything. I hope this makes sense. I hope this gives you a good starting block to be able to kind of use this more and more. It has a lot more capabilities, as you can start to see. So start, think about it, think about how you can use this. And yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see y'all later. Bye.